Welcome to the South Carolina Lead and the This Week in South Carolina crossover episode here at SCTV Studios in Columbia. I'm Gavin Jackson. Joining me along with this wonderful crowd in studio for our pre-election 2024 show is Associated Press national politics reporter Meg Kinnard and South Carolina Public Radio's Maayan Schechter to discuss election 2024 up and down the ballot. Welcome to you both and welcome to our studio audience. Okay, everyone's feeling pretty excited with less than a week to go. How's everyone feeling? A little anxious? Yes, no, maybe? Okay. We're all I see a couple beers out there. So thank you all for being here. Thank you all for being here too. Meg, I want to start with you. We're going to start national, then work our way down the ballot here. You have been covering this race, the campaign cycle since, I don't know, when did it start? Can you remember when it started?
It started in 2021, actually. Yeah. So right after the last one, we started the 2024 cycle.
And I was going to say, the last live taping that we did was back in May of 2023, and we were talking about Nikki Haley and Senator Tim Scott, who was about to jump in the race. And now here we are, just days away from Election Day. We are in the closing arguments portion of this race. So kind of tell us about the final pitches that we've been hearing from former President Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris and who they're trying to sway at this point.
I mean, who they're trying to sway is actually the easier part of that to answer. It really is the 7 battleground states that anybody who's been paying attention to the news at all related to the presidential campaign has heard about these 7 states. Obviously, North Carolina to our north and Georgia very close by, and then some others in the east and Midwest and out west. Pennsylvania is really the state that's gotten the most attention. It's the one that both major candidates have visited the most. And even within that, there are certain counties that are considered to be more apt to swing from one side of the aisle to the other. And so really, it's not the only places that the candidates are visiting, but that really is part of what these campaigns see as make or break, perhaps, for their general election prospects. What we're hearing from the Trump campaign and the Harris campaign and the candidates themselves in their closing arguments in these last couple of days are really portraits of 2 different types of America that they see. A lot of what we've heard from Donald Trump in these closing days has been very similar to what he's been talking about on the campaign trail for months, portraying Kamala Harris, obviously who's been part of the Biden administration, as at fault for what he sees are problems from the economy to immigration to just about every international or national issue. He blames her since she's been part of the administration. And he says, I've already been president. Think about what a great situation it was, economically speaking and otherwise, when I was in office. Don't you want to go back to that? What we've heard from Kamala Harris is warnings about what she sees are threats that could come in a second Trump administration, and her commitment to being kind of the adult in the room when it comes to foreign policy for the United States government, but also talking about the economy and how things are actually doing better now under the Biden-Harris administration and how she would commit to keeping that momentum going. So it is, what we would anticipate to hear from top of the ticket nominees, obviously a compare and contrast. But in this closing week, it kind of has been a reiteration of a lot of the messaging that we've heard all along.
And before we kind of talk about what they're talking about in these closing arguments, you have been in pretty much every swing state too, right?
All but one. I'd never made it to Nevada this time around, and that is something I will always regret.
Yeah, and that's because you are a national politics reporter. You're part of the DC Bureau with the AP. So even though you're based here in South Carolina, which we're fortunate to have, you get to go all over as well, for better or for worse.
Lots of miles in my car, lots of airline miles, so maybe I can take a vacation afterwards.
But Meg, you weren't in D.C. last night, but you watched Kamala Harris give her closing argument there on the ellipse. Has she done enough, you think, since she became the nominee in late July to really differentiate herself from President Joe Biden?
It's been very tough, I think. And obviously, when Kamala Harris, the first time on The View, was asked that question, what would you have done differently compared to Joe Biden? She said, I really can't think of anything. And that's the answer that's kind of followed her along, even though she has made some tweaks to it and said that she has come up with a few areas in which she would have maybe gone stronger or done a little bit of a pivot. Still, the fact that she said it that way has been kind of difficult for her to recover from. And it's certainly been something that Donald Trump and his allies have been reminding people about. But I think that what we heard from Vice President Harris last night was a little bit of the new generation spin that she's been trying to put forth. Clearly, she is a lot younger than Joe Biden, and that's part of why I think we're seeing her atop the ticket, given his departure from the race earlier this summer. But it's spinning forward. It's talking about, okay, so yes, we accomplished this during the Biden-Harris administration, but these are ways that I would like to further that progress. So it was kind of a little bit more of a forward look than perhaps we've heard during some of her earlier stump speeches.
Yeah, that to-do list versus a grievance list.
Exactly. What she said Donald Trump would do is he's going to be trying to get with his enemies, whereas she's going to come into office with a list of things she wants to accomplish.
And pivoting to Trump here, you watch a lot of his speeches. I don't think people realize that when it comes to how the Associated Press covers the presidential campaign, you all have someone usually on the ground watching these speeches, but then folks back home watching from wherever they are, just so they can kind of pick up on anything that someone who's out in the crowd when you're surrounded by a lot of different things, a lot of stimuli, you might have missed. So you
And
hear
also you can't really connect to anything, as we've all been there with our cell phones and laptops not
and people
working.
are yelling at you. They
It
don't.
can be a little chaotic, so it's a lot easier to have someone backstopping you on a live stream.
So, so that being said, you watch a lot of those. You continue to hear this policy versus personality when it comes to former President Trump, but it doesn't always seem like that. And in fact, he doesn't always stay on message. Much to Senator Lindsey Graham's chagrin, we see him on the Sunday morning shows really trying to focus that message. So we also looked at the former President Trump's big rally there at Madison Square Garden over the weekend, where he laid out more grievances than anything else. So how is that working when it comes to what we're hearing from President Trump?
In terms of what we heard at the Madison Square Garden event, which was intended to be his closing argument on Sunday night, a lot of it was overshadowed almost immediately by something that not Donald Trump said, but one of the comedians who was introducing him, referring to Puerto Rico as an island of garbage. That was the entire next news cycle, which is still bleeding into further news cycles. And so that detracted from some of what Donald Trump was talking about. In that speech, we did hear a lot of the similar type stuff, although perhaps delivered in a little bit different manner. There was a lot of nostalgia for this moment for Donald Trump in his hometown. Obviously, he doesn't expect to really win the state of New York, I don't think. It was more of a national attention moment. But he was still talking about what he sees as flaws in Kamala Harris and her proposals, the dangers that he warns about in terms of security along the U.S.-Mexico border. He was still hitting a lot of the same issues that he talks about, but it was kind of trying to package it in this feel-good sort of moment that unfortunately he did not get that next news cycle because of the comedian.
But if you're his supporters, if you're his campaign, aren't you really trying to get more folks? And do you think that that kind of language, that kind of, here's how I've been aggrieved, here's what I'm mad about, here's how we're going to make things better, but not really give too many details. Isn't there a better way to maybe bring more people in versus maybe coming across as negative?
It's a good question. A lot of consultants analyze this and they look at how Donald Trump is speaking on the stump and saying a lot of the things you just mentioned, and they're like, he's really just talking to his base. He's talking to the people who already support him. He's not really going after those swing voters or those Pennsylvania counties that, really are kind of at stake in terms of the undecided voters, because I think a lot of us would go and talk to people, our friends and neighbors. I mean, most people have made up their minds by this point. There aren't a whole lot of folks who are completely unaware of who they're going to pick, whether they're already voting now or who they're going to pick on Tuesday. But it is up to surrogates like Lindsey Graham sometimes to go out on the Sunday shows and to do other media interviews and try to really get into the policy that when Donald Trump is on the stump kind of weaving this message, he talks about it as a weave of stories together that he's not necessarily hitting on specifically, so they have to kind of go and reiterate some of those points.
And of course, South Carolina is not one of those 7 swing states that we're talking about, but we are wedged between two of them.
Right in the middle.
We're that little tomato. But we're taping this episode on Wednesday, October 30th, and today both candidates were in North Carolina making those arguments. And when you start looking at the polls and electoral math, Meg, there have been a lot of curveballs in this election, to say the least, but one big one in North Carolina has been down ballot in that turmoil, including the fallout with Republican Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson's past post to a pornographic website as he runs for governor, and then some disturbing past rhetoric from that Republican candidate for the school superintendent race. So based on your time in North Carolina, which you've covered a lot of the campaign trail in, do you think that that might move the needle when it comes to how North Carolina goes? Obviously, Joe Biden did not win North Carolina, but it was very narrow, and the Democrats are really trying to get something there too. And they always split the ticket up there in North Carolina, it seems like. So could this turmoil plus maybe some recent comments change things?
It is very interesting to look at a state like North Carolina that currently has a Democratic governor. And clearly there is a governor's race going on, but they have a Democrat in that office, but yet they're very much in play for Republicans for a presidential election. In South Carolina, clearly we haven't had that circumstance in quite some time. But when I talk to voters in North Carolina about Mark Robinson, asking about these allegations against him, I have yet to meet someone who is really concerned enough about them to think about not supporting Donald Trump over it and not supporting Mark Robinson over it. Frankly, it doesn't really seem to make a big difference to them, even in the governor's race. Granted, these are people I'm talking to generally at events for former President Donald Trump, so you can kind of telegraph to see where they might be feeling. But all in all, you're absolutely right. North Carolina is a place where both the Harris campaign and the Trump campaign have been spending time, spending a lot of money and resources. We're seeing all kinds of ads. I can't tell you how many I heard and saw every time that I've been in that state over the past couple of weeks and months. So it is interesting to see our northern neighbor get so much attention, even though a Democrat hasn't carried that state since Barack Obama did in 2008 in the presidential election. And, yet again, it's to see both campaigns seeing it as enough of a possibility where they're really going to be spending all this time and focusing on it. That is definitely interesting, and I think it's going to come down to the wire there.
Yeah, there'll be a lot to watch for North Carolina, too, up and down the ballot, like we're talking about. We have a couple more minutes with you, Meg, before we jump to my own, but I want to ask about Nikki Haley, our former governor, former Republican presidential candidate. We were both on the campaign trail covering her extensively, but you just wrote about her again. We have a couple days left here in the campaign, and we haven't seen her on the trail outside of the RNC when we were both up there. All of us were up there in Milwaukee for that and our fun journey back.
So fun.
But tell us about the state of play there when it comes to Haley and her relationship with the Trump campaign at this point.
Nikki Haley says that she hasn't spoken with Donald Trump since June, and we are now in almost November. So you can do the math, and that was quite a while ago, even before the Republican National Convention. So that tells you they did not speak while they were both in the same space, and she was advocating for him. But from what Nikki Haley and her team are telling me is they have made it very clear to the Trump campaign and to Donald Trump that she is available, that she obviously is the Republican who got, next to him, the most votes in the whole primary. She stuck with it longer than any of the other candidates. So purportedly, there were a lot of voters, even after she left the race, who were continuing to vote for her in primaries and caucuses that followed, whether that's a protest vote or whether that's people who really saw themselves as more aligned with her and wanted to participate in that Republican primary. That is of note. And so for Donald Trump not to have reached out to her, it's funny, it actually benefits Nikki Haley. Sure, she gets credit for coming out and saying, I support my party's nominee, I do not support Kamala Harris. I appreciate a lot of the Harris people who are now trying to go after those voters who supported me, Nikki Haley, in the primaries, but I don't support her. But it benefits Nikki Haley because if she has future political aspirations of her own, she still gets that credit for saying, I support my party's nominee, but also not appearing with him on the trail, given that he is such a polarizing figure even within the Republican Party, could actually better serve her on her own if she chooses to run for the presidency again or seek some other office. That's not something that she is directly telling me, but having covered South Carolina and having covered Nikki Haley as long as we have, I think we all know that there is typically a look at what's next and what's to come. So we'll see. Yeah. Maybe you heard it here first. Maybe it never happens. But
well, I mean, it's like when I asked her right before the primary in February. Is this just a part of you setting up a future run, saying "I told you so"? If at the time Joe Biden wins, but now if Kamala Harris wins, as she kind of predicted was going to be the case.
She certainly did multiple times, over and over.
We'll see after November 5th or whenever we get the election results.
Whenever it's over.
But Meg, wrapping up here, Haley got picked in Trump's first term as a thank you to then Lieutenant Governor Henry McMaster, who endorsed Trump early on. Could we see some potential South Carolinians jumping into a Trump cabinet again?
I think it's very possible. A name that comes up all the time is Tim Scott, who clearly was in the presidential race for about 6 months himself, but then has become one of Donald Trump's big surrogates. He was stumping in some of those other early states, not just our home state of South Carolina. He's been out on the trail. He's still out on the trail campaigning for him, and he often gets mentioned in terms of a financial related appointment, maybe because of his service on the Senate Banking Committee. So I think it's very possible that we would see him being considered for that. Lindsey Graham's name also comes up a lot. Obviously, he is a senator and has been serving in the Senate for some time representing South Carolina. He is another of Donald Trump's big surrogates and supporters going back to that 2016 race, after he dropped out himself, of course. So I think that's another possibility. But if either one of those things happen, or if they both were to happen, we would have 2 open Senate seats here in South Carolina, the appointment of which would be up to who? Governor Henry McMaster, who is also a major Trump backer and surrogate. So that's just all kinds of ways that a potential Trump administration could affect our home state, even though we aren't one of those 7 battlegrounds. And that'll be something that we're watching super carefully.
You can definitely last longer as a senator for 6 years versus being in the Trump administration. You never know how long that's going to last.
And South Carolina is known for having longevity in our senators, so there's also that term.
But segue us into Maayan and talking about Congress and looking at what you think might happen based on the top of the ticket and how that could affect what could happen in the control of Congress, Meg.
It's very interesting for people like us to think about how these two things work together, because thinking about which presidential administration you get, if they have a Congress that they can work with or not, depending on who's controlling the House or the Senate or both, or if the president doesn't have either, that could be a tricky situation. In South Carolina, I don't think that we're going to be seeing a lot of differences and surprises in our races here. But I think that if we do have a Democratic administration, we may end up seeing one of those circumstances where the Republican representatives from South Carolina are frequently finding themselves at odds and having a lot of grievances with a Democratic administration in the White House. We have seen that. I think that would continue. If there's a Republican in the White House, there are a lot of Republicans who have supported Donald Trump in our current delegation who will likely be in the next iteration of that delegation. And so there could be some opportunities for projects to come back to South Carolina for sure, but also to have some of those members highlighted as they are out there supporting Donald Trump if he's elected.
So we're nice, well situated here in South Carolina.
There's always something going on in South Carolina, for sure.
Thank you, Meg. But Maayan, when it comes to the balance of Congress, none of that hinges, like Meg was saying, on our state because it's pretty well set. I don't want to ruin any surprises for November 5th, but based on gerrymandering and how the districts are drawn, it's pretty much ideological where it's going to go based on how things are drawn right now. But there will be a new face in our delegation following the election in the Republican-controlled 3rd District, if it goes as we expect it to, because it's such a conservative district, and that's Sherry Biggs, who narrowly beat that firebrand pastor Mark Burns, who's been in South Carolina politics or tangential to it for some time, and she won by 1,100 votes in that primary. We always talk about primaries really being the big decider when it comes to who's going to be on that November ballot, but that's when you really get your voice heard if you're in one of these districts and you feel like you can't make a change. Look into the June primary. But what's going on in the 3rd District, Maayan?
Right. I mean, exactly as you mentioned, party primaries are where, as everyone knows, I think, where races get decided in South Carolina for the most part. Sherry Biggs, while not really known super statewide, is known in Republican circles. She and her husband have been big time donors and they're allies to Henry McMaster for a very long time. We didn't really get a whole lot of time to talk to her when we were in Milwaukee, but Republicans that I've talked to say she is very nice, very easygoing, will be a good fit in the delegation. Of course, as we know, Congressman Jeff Duncan decided not to run. He is going through a divorce, had some very public allegations of infidelity, and so that was not working with his district. She is pretty well funded on her own, but she's a well-funded candidate. Again, this is an upstate district, and as you mentioned, if maybe Mark Burns had won the primary, maybe we would be having perhaps a slightly different conversation. I don't think a wildly different conversation. It's a tough district for Democrats to win, and especially after this redistricting process, it's even tougher. So she is going to be our second Republican Congresswoman from South Carolina with Nancy Mace, of course. And yeah, we'll see how she does, but she is on her way to being the next Congresswoman from South Carolina.
Yeah, and when those seats open up like it did with Jeff Duncan, people really pounce on them because they don't turn over very often. And when you get it, unless you really mess up, it seems like it's kind of on cruise control for the most part. You vote no if you want to, you vote yes if you want to, and until you mess up on your own, it seems like you're kind of on cruise control. Like
incumbency is very strong, and it's hard to beat in South Carolina.
But in the 4th District right over there, the Greenville-Spartanburg District, we did see incumbent Congressman William Timmons have a very bruising primary in June between him and Adam Morgan, the House Freedom Caucus here in the State House. But again, that's another very strong conservative district. It went by 20 points in 2020 for Trump. So hate to say for Catherine Harvey, but we don't expect a very big surprise here. So what's the latest on that district and what you expect to see? Because there has been some, some interaction there on the campaign trail.
Right. I actually think that Catherine Harvey, she's the chairwoman of the Spartanburg County Democratic Party, despite the fact that, again, she is a Democrat in a conservative district. She has run what I think has been a much better campaign, a bit more of an aggressive campaign than we've seen from a lot of Democrats running in that district. She talked to us when we were in Chicago for the DNC about how they've been reaching out to voters who were not active in past election cycles. I think there was some 6,000, which of course is not a crazy big number, but can make a difference for down ballot, as we're talking about down ballot races. What I am interested with that race is, Spartanburg, Greenville area. Does she bring out voters who maybe didn't vote in the midterms or even in the past general to help vote for some of these down ballot races, state house, local races, things like that? So despite the fact that, again, uphill battle for a Democrat to win that one, maybe she's able to help turn out voters for other local races.
Yeah, that's what we're, especially in a presidential election year versus the midterms when sadly it really does drop off. But the closest competition is always in the 1st Congressional District down there in the Low Country on the coast in Charleston down to Hilton Head with Congresswoman Nancy Mace, who flipped that district red by 1.3 points back when she was first elected in 2020. That was also when the district went by 6 points for Donald Trump. She faces off against Democrat Michael B. Moore. Now, Mace easily won her second term by defeating Democrat Annie Andrews by 14 points in 2022. What can we expect here?
Yeah, this is a district that perhaps was a bit more competitive in previous cycles, and the U.S. Supreme Court has kind of ended that a bit. They upheld the map that the Republican-controlled legislature drew, and that was over a lawsuit, of course, where black voters in that district felt that they were disenfranchised the way that the legislature carved it all up. I mean, they basically moved Charleston completely out of the district and into the 6th district with Jim Clyburn. And so vastly, obviously, different areas. So yeah, she's in a very, very good situation. I saw some reporting last week or maybe over the weekend that talked about how she's been running a bit quieter of a campaign, and she's not worried. I would argue with the word quiet. I'd probably fight a little bit over that because I think she's been pretty.
What social media
I think
account
she's been
you're
pretty
on,
active.
what cable news channel,
And
yeah.
she's been very active within the Charleston County Sheriff's race. But yes, in the traditional sense, I think Nancy Mace has probably not been doing not creating a lot of new ads, maybe not doing like the traditional door knocking stuff that maybe people would do when they're in situations that are a bit more precarious. So clearly she feels very, very comfortable walking into Election Day.
Yeah, she had a little bit of a primary there too, but she easily won outright. We have about 5 minutes left, and I want to get to the State House first. But a question that we always get from the audience that we're going to preempt right now is talking about, will this ever change? And when we look at Democratic Congressman Jim Clyburn's 6th district, that's the only one that ever goes all Democratic. Trump has won all the other districts in the state. We just mentioned the 1st, 3rd, and 4th, but there's also Congressman Joe Wilson in the 2nd, Congressman Ralph Norman in the 5th, and then Congressman Russell Fry in the 7th out there on the Grand Strand of the PD. All three of them are expected to easily defeat their Democratic and third-party challengers, and this is because we're talking about how these maps are drawn in the Republican-controlled State House. So, Maayan, several people have asked us about this, as we've always talked about, but based on population growth and voting trends, we're not going purple anytime soon like our neighbors.
Yeah, I mean, I think you pretty much answered it. The people that are moving to South Carolina are traditionally more Republican voters. They're older. You mentioned the 1st district, the 5th district, York County area. Then there's the 7th district on that Myrtle Beach, Horry County. I mean, those are fast-growing areas of the state, and they're not trending toward the center, and they're not really trending toward the left either. You were talking to Drew McKissick, the chairman of the Republican Party, the other day, and Drew was telling you about how they can literally track voters now. They have the software, the program, the data to track voters where they can see how they voted in past elections from other states. And he said the voters that they see coming in are traditional Republican voters. And so, yeah, do I think anything's going to change, in the next cycle? I'm not really sure. Maybe we're going to get another district.
Yeah.
Maybe we see something like that. But right now, I don't think so.
Let's go to the State House, Maayan. And then we were talking about Drew, and he was on the show talking about how they expect to flip 2 House and 2 Senate seats. He wouldn't say which ones. How exciting for all of us. But when we talk about that, what do you see at play when it comes to these numbers? When it comes to 30 Republicans in the Senate, 87 Republicans in the House, and they're on the verge of getting a supermajority like they have in the House, but over in the Senate. So where do you see some of the big races, the possible big flips happening?
Yeah, we say every election cycle, this is the most important election. I think if you're a Democrat, this is every election cycle is the most important. So just as background, you've heard me say this 100 times. In 2020, Democrats lost 5 seats in the State House in the 2022 midterms. And then, by the way, that was at the time, and I almost forgot, where we had a massive U.S. Senate race between Lindsey Graham and Jamie Harrison. Yeah. Democrats thought they were going to get a huge turnout. They did, just not in their favor. Then in 2022, Democrats lost more seats in the House, even seats that really they had no business losing, seats that Joe Biden had won in 2020. So when we were at a Get Out the Vote event the other day in Columbia, Crystal Spain, the chairwoman of the South Carolina Democratic Party, talked about how, what does victory look like on Election Day? It looks like them defending the incumbents. And that's huge. And that's simple in words, not simple in how it may work out because of the way that we are going to have turnout. But yeah, if we're talking about here, especially in the Midlands, I think is in the House, House District 75, that race, that's between incumbent Democratic lawmaker Heather Bauer and she is facing off against the former representative of that seat, Kirkman Finley, who's a well-known name. That's one that is the swingiest district that we have in Richland County, and is very close. We have some Senate races. Who's going to succeed? Longtime Senator Nikki Setzler, Democrat from Lexington County. That's a race between GOP challenger Jason Gary and Russell Ott, who's a House Democratic lawmaker, of course. There are races in Clarendon County, in Sumter County, in Darlington County. I mean, I don't know which races Drew McKissick is talking about, but and remember in 2020, we thought maybe Republicans would pick up at least one seat. We didn't think that they would pick up 3 seats in the Senate. And so even though they say 2 seats, I mean, it could be more.
In my own, we have about 30 seconds left, and you did a great job getting through all this, but record turnout right now, early voting turnout. We're probably going to reach more than 1 million, obviously, but how do you see that? What are we looking at right now, October 30th?
Yeah, more than 1 million people have already turned out to vote, plus absentee voters even higher. I think we could probably see higher than that number even on election day. We had 2 million something voters turn out in the 2022 midterms, somewhere in that area in 2020. I mean, I think we could be on the verge of surpassing both of those numbers. We've just seen, obviously, a voting base that's very electrified to show up this election.
We have to wrap up right now, but we're going to have more online. We're going to cut out right now, but that's AP National Politics reporter Meg Kennard and South Carolina Public Radio reporter Maayan Schechter. Thank you all very much, and that's it for us this week. For South Carolina ETV, I'm Gavin Jackson. Be well, South Carolina.